Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit more on this book and talk about its characters, what it's based on specifically, and where we are in this situation as the story takes place. This book is historical fiction, but based on two real-world figures. These were both Catholic priests who renounced their faith under torture. The two priests' names were Cristóvão Ferreira, who was a Portuguese missionary, and the other was Giuseppe Chiara, an Italian. In this book, Ferreira's last name remains the same, but Chiara's name is changed to Sebastian Rodrigues. So our main protagonist here is Sebastian Rodrigues. He and two of his fellow Jesuit priests set off on a voyage to find their lost mentor, Ferreira, who has lost contact with the Catholic Church in Rome. It is rumored he has committed apostasy by trampling the Fiumi, an image of Christ which the Japanese authorities have instigated as a method for determining who is a Christian. The three students cannot believe that their beloved teacher, Ferreira, who has been a missionary in Japan for 33 years, could have committed this act, even under torture. So when Rodrigues arrives in Japan, very shortly afterwards, he gets separated from his remaining companion and finds himself being hunted by the officials, even though he wants to do what he was sent there to do, which is to tend to the Christian flock. He finds himself on a run for his life from this sadistic magistrate, whose name is Inoue. Now, getting into the writing of this book, it has an interesting format. The first 4 chapters are letters from Rodrigues, the younger man, to his fellow Catholics. And actually, I wanted to turn to one of the discussion questions in the back of this book, because I thought it was worth mentioning. And the question is, Rodrigues is fully aware that his letters may never reach Portugal, and may in fact never be read by anyone. Why then does he write them? And something I was thinking about as I was reading this, and thinking about the fact that probably no one would read this, is how we've kind of lost something in the modern day because we don't do this asynchronous communication as much anymore. We might send text messages and expect to get a reply back in hopefully 24 hours. We might send emails, expect to get one back in a week, but writing a letter to someone, even if you were able to send it, would take months for them to receive. So the details and the information you're going to provide are going to be so much more elaborate. And so I think that it's good for the writer as much for the reader to be able to get in depth into what's going on, and knowing that the other person doesn't have a chance to ask questions, but you must offer up enough information from the beginning so that they can understand. And actually, this was something that Jordan Peterson tweeted the other day. I'm not a big Jordan Peterson fan, as you may know, but there are things that he talks about that I do appreciate, and one of them was this idea that you should journal your memories and write things down, and I think there's a lot of value in that. Chapter 5 switches to third person. Chapter 6 goes from past tense to present tense for one paragraph and goes back to past tense after that. He also uses present tense in chapter 8 during the crisis point of this whole story. And then chapter 10 is, for the most part, a series of diary entries from a Dutch clerk in Nagasaki. So a mix of different tenses and perspectives. I thought it was very effective. Effective because it was purposeful in helping you gradually detach from the character, which is a little strange. Usually you might expect to grow closer to a character, but in this case we actually become more and more distant from Rodrigues. And I'll probably get into that a little bit more later on. The motif of silence is prevalent throughout the book, and this really interested me because I've been thinking lately about motifs in general, or little themes or objects that keep coming back in a story, and whether those are effective or if they're just gimmicky, like what is a good example. So this one is a great example of how the concept of silence keeps coming back, and not just the perceived silence of God, but other silences as well. In the pitch darkness, we held our breath in silence. What sort of crazy official was laying a trap like this? I prayed and prayed that this awful noonday silence might forever be taken away from the village over which it hung so ominously. The rain falls unceasingly on the sea, and the sea which killed them surges on uncannily in silence. So that was the scene where, early on in the book, two Christians are killed by basically slow drowning. They're placed on crosses in the water, and as the tide comes in, they start drowning. This is just the first in a sequence of events where Rodrigues starts to have a lot of doubts. I'm going to get back into that a little bit more later, but the silence is prevalent throughout the book, and it's juxtaposed strongly with animal sounds and grotesque smells and disgusting food. All these other things are an assault on Rodrigues' senses, but silence alone is the one thing that doesn't touch him, and yet he wishes something would happen. I think that it's an effective motif in this book. It certainly creates this heaviness that reminded me very much of Kafka. If you've read The Trial, for example, just this relentless weight, and that heaviness is just, it's hard to read. It's not a difficult book in terms of writing style, but this is the kind of book you'll probably want to take some breaks from. Something else that struck me in this book was the use of common symbols and language in terms of the Roman Catholic tradition. And I think there is definitely value in that. Coming from a Protestant perspective, it is a little bit foreign to me in some regards, but I can appreciate the fact that one thing that connected the Japanese and the Portuguese through their faith, well, their faith in and of itself, and also the use of Latin and icons and things of that nature. Padre, Padre. The old man made the sign of the cross as he uttered the words, and in his voice there was a gentle note of solicitude for our plight. As for us, this Padre, spoken in our own beloved Portuguese tongue, was something we had never dreamt of hearing in this place. Needless to say, the old man could not know more Portuguese than this, but before our eyes he made the sign of the cross, showing a bond of something that held us together. Needless to say, they cannot have Mass on these days since there are no priests, but they secretly set up a holy picture in one of the houses and recite their prayers in front of it. They say their prayers in Latin just like us, Pater Noster, Ave Maria, and so on. And then Rodrigues also mentions that the peasants here, just like those at Tomogi, keep pressing me for a small crucifix or medal or holy picture or some such thing. And when I replied that I had left all these things behind, they looked quite crushed. Finally, I had to take my rosary and, unfastening the beads, give one to each of them. I think that obviously if the objects in themselves become, like, if you can't do without them, I think that might indicate there is a problem, but I think in general that physical objects can have a great purpose as reminders of the spiritual, right? So that's a whole nother topic and aside, but I thought that the use of having those common symbols was very meaningful and really got me thinking. So from there, I want to talk about the characters, and I'm going to go a little bit backwards here. I'm going to start with some of the more minor characters and then move towards Rodrigues himself. I already mentioned the Christians in this book, the minor characters who are Japanese believers and who are absolutely overjoyed to meet this priest from Portugal. They live in extreme poverty. They suffer terrible abuse at the hands of their feudal overlords. One thing he mentions is that they see something much greater and more beautiful in Christianity than the lives they're leading under these overlords. For the first time, they have met men who treated them like human beings. It was the human kindness and charity of the fathers that touched their hearts. Not only that, but they endure these sufferings with such bravery. And that's certainly starkly contrasted with Rodrigues' doubt and his gradual descent. Another character who comes up over and over again in the book is this Kichijiro. I saw someone on Goodreads referred to him as the Gollum character, Gollum from The Lord of the Rings. Basically, the Judas type that I was referring to earlier. He repeatedly apostatizes and betrays other Christians, and including Rodrigues. Kichijiro, it's not like he had one moment of denial. He lives this life of denial. And he claims over and over again that he's inherently weak, and as if he can't help any of what he does. What's kind of troubling is Rodrigues starts to come to Kichijiro's point of view. And so on page 82, he says, basically, if some of the Christians had been born in another time, things would be different. I do take issue with that. I think that going back to that verse from Corinthians, God puts you in a certain time for a reason. And I don't think we should be thinking in terms of, if only I lived in a different time, I would be a different person, because you are going to be who you are for this time and place. And God will give you the tools if you truly have faith. He will give you the ability to persevere. That's the promise of Corinthians. But let's move on. Ferreira. So here's the older mentor, the master or the wizard type who has succumbed to the enemy. And this is one of the most depressing types of characters. We talked about the good ones in the live stream we did on character types. But the master who succumbs to the enemy, he's like Saruman in The Lord of the Rings. He is your hero who has failed you. And not only failed you, but failed the idea that is greater than himself. And that is truly horrifying. When Rodrigues finally meets Ferreira, for one thing, he cannot believe Ferreira is still alive, and he sees this as yet another sign of God's apparent silence, which I thought was interesting. Ferreira, for his part, has completely given up, and he says, quote, "This country is a swamp. In time you will come to see that for yourself. This country is a more terrible swamp than you can imagine. Whenever you plant a sapling in this swamp, the roots begin to rot, the leaves grow yellow and wither, and we have planted the sapling of Christianity in this swamp." And Ferreira essentially claims that all the history with the earlier missionaries and their work, he basically claims that everything that's happened is more or less a lie. I mean, Rodrigues is torn between, I guess, wanting to believe it and not wanting to believe it. Again, I go back to the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." So this idea that there might be a place or a nation where Christianity simply cannot take root, I don't think that's biblical. That to me would be the red flag of red flags, if nothing else, by which Rodrigues should have completely disbelieved Ferreira. But let's talk about Rodrigues. We talked about the master type, so his mentor, his hero, Ferreira, coming to such a dismal end to his career and his faith. I think this is a good lesson to us that even the best and the greatest of humans are susceptible. And that's why idolatry is dangerous, even if the person you idolize is apparently moral or good. Humans have limits, and to place anyone on such a high pedestal can be very, very dangerous. There's also a danger of over-romanticizing the past. So one of the things that Rodrigues does throughout the book, really, he has this romanticized vision of what persecution and martyrdom look like, which make what he's experiencing and observing in Japan, these brutal, horrific tortures and deaths, he's shocked, I guess. And I think you have to separate yourself from the past to some extent and realize that everything is going to be far worse than you imagine. And to romanticize the past is not only, going to be hard on you, but it's doing a disservice to the people who have lived before you. So it's, again, a good lesson of how you got to be careful with some of these things we tend to fall into in the way we view history and the people who came before us. I did mention earlier that Rodrigues struggles with doubts throughout the book. He doubts himself. He doubts whether he wants to do this for the right reasons or whether he's always wanted to be simply a hero. Of course, he doubts his faith, which is the biggest problem in the book, and doesn't understand why God seems to be silent while his people suffer. And then I noticed very early on in the book, Rodrigues had this gut reaction when hearing about this dilemma of whether to trample on the Fumi, the image of Christ. Like, he has this gut reaction early on to do so. And I think that shows how very early on, he was on this downward path. So the inner pendulum swings back and forth between his hope and faith versus his doubt and despair. And he does have moments of true inspiration, I would say, and holding on to the image of Christ before his eyes. So in the first part of the book, he identifies with Christ. He looks into a pool of water at one point, and that vision he has of Christ's face kind of merges with his own subconsciously, not intentionally. And then also as he's betrayed by the man named Kichijiro, when he's being betrayed by that guy, he also identifies with Christ. But later on, he ends up comparing himself to Kichijiro after he has committed apostasy. This is where, again, I feel like the lines between the Peter character and the Judas character are kind of blurred. On page 183, in present tense, it goes, "The face of the Fumi says to Rodrigues, quote, 'It was to be trampled on by men that I was born into this world. It was to share men's pain that I carried my cross,' end quote. And then the rooster crows. So again, up to interpretation there, whether you think it's, actually he's like envisioning things or really hearing something. Very uncomfortable bit of writing. And I would say when you don't have a clear delineation between the Peter and the Judas types, as I've already mentioned, you'll start to see them merge into one when you read those sections. And I think that that's not a good way to be reading this. I'll just be honest. I think that's getting a little bit too much into the gray area.